I was watching the debates, um, Andrew Wilson against this, I forgot his name, it's a secular humanist or something. I think he had like a couple of debates or so. The other one was with, Gnostic Informant. Well, I kind of watched both of them, but they were interesting. It was kind of hard for me to track because I'm not, it's hard for me to follow because I'm not an expert in all the political stuff. But overall, I enjoyed it. I was just looking at this guy's video called Culture Cats, and he's just saying that Andrew lost the debate or so, like he thinks so. I guess because that Andrew undermined his own position or something. But overall, it was a good debate, at least I think it was. And then the other debate that I saw was between God Logic and the Orthodox Muslim. I thought it was a good debate. I obviously feel the Muslim won. Obviously, wanted to get my thoughts on it though, like at least thoughts on some things that were said or so, as well as the Andrew Wilson debate. What was the main thing? Yeah, because he keeps insisting that if Nicene Christians, right, like everyone who confesses the Nicene Creed is Christian or something. So he wants all Christians to be unified under Nicene Orthodoxy, which is convenient for his church, right, the Orthodox Church, which ties into monarchy and all this other stuff, the religion of the Imperium or whatever. Yeah, but Nicene Christians are not like a unified thing. Like Nicene Orthodoxy is not the unified, not a basis for unity, I should say. They just have the problems with, the Orientals and the Coptics, right? And then the other Orthodox, right? Like the Assyrians, Ethiopians, and like other Orthodox that don't agree with Eastern Orthodoxy on everything, right? And then the Catholics, right? We still have things like these are all Nicene Christians, but they're just not in agreement on the Filioque, and then some are, like some of the Orthodox are like Old Calendarist and New Calendarist, right? Like they believe in the Old Calendar, and then the dispute between Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian Christians, right? Like they don't agree with the language. So there are other reasons why, like you have like violent schisms, or like they don't have communion with each other over these issues. But they're all Nicene, you see. So that's why I'm saying like Nicaea is not the basis for unity. Traditionalism, Christian traditionalism, that's part of Christian traditionalism, right? The traditional values. Because religion is important to you, dogmas are important, but they're the very things that can also cause like the divisions and the violent schisms and stuff. It's also based on those same traditional values. But Christian traditionalism, right? It's not in and of itself a source of unity. It can be a source of disunity, right? I wanted to go over, I think his name is Agen. His channel is Apostolic Orthodoxy. He's a Coptic Orthodox. Nicene Christian, basically. Just making videos against, the Ortho Bros, I guess. Like Jay Dyer, David Erhan, Quay, right? Orthodox Jihada, basically. And just going over their disagreements. Why language is important, right? Like how you say certain things. Even though I don't 100% agree with the Coptic Church, right? The Coptic Orthodox. But they do have a point, though. Like how, the reason why I like his video on this Coptic Orthodox is because he able to understand the councils and the saints, the words, right? Like he's definitely a lot more knowledgeable than me, right? Like he traces the changes, like substance, usia, person, right? Like over time, like how Chalcedon sort of changed, right? Their meaning and their understanding of those words. But it's like Andrew Wilson, they think that the system doesn't change, but I'm saying, like, yeah, it kind of does. It's just very subtle, like with the words, right? But they make significant differences, right? These small, subtle changes. They reflect theology. That's why, like, when I see the disputes between Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian, it's always about, like, the words, even from, in, and up to natures, right? It's a big deal. So it doesn't matter if you have the Trinity in common. It's also like, it's also language, how you think, right? That you have to go through church councils. I mean, that's how Nicene Christians have to think, right? Because you're is part of, the creed is part of the imperium, right? The monarchy, divine right of kings, councils, ecumenical councils, right? You must seek approval of the empire. You have to go through the emperor and the empire and the old church, right? The magisterial order. And so that's why you cannot just go straight to the Bible and, believe the Trinity because you see it in the Bible, right? Now you have to go through the councils. Otherwise, the fact that you think differently, it could be a problem as well. At least that's the impression that I get, right? Like there's a certain order to the way the magisterial tradition or the imperial tradition thinks, right? I mean, you can blame Protestantism all you want, but at the end of the day, it's like the roots of your problems, your schisms, remember, because you were here first, right? Like Orthodoxy, Catholicism, or so. Then he claims that, there were no Protestants in Nicaea, right? Even though I sort of disagree. I'm not saying there were sola believing Protestants, right? But you certainly were filled with, like, schisms, schismatics, Protestant type spirit, not really reflecting the universal Catholic spirit, right, that you claim to have, that you say in the liturgy. Because there's people disputing the creed, the language, the ideas, wanting to reform it because it didn't sound scriptural, so to say. Because, like, the interpreter for, I guess, Nicene Orthodoxy, right, is, the Constantine and Athanasius, and according to their understanding of God in Christ, right, the tradition that Athanasius comes from. And so that's where I believe the problems, like, where it stems from. Because these people interpret what is the imperial theology, right? How you interpret and read it into the Bible. And so that's where I really believe the problem comes from. So Adrian, like he's Coptic, and he talks about when he says, like, remember it says here that the Eastern Orthodoxy admit that Diophysitism is metaphysically incoherent and their church evolved. You can see it for yourself, right? You can just watch this whole video. It just goes over all these things. Talk about substance. The Eastern Orthodox admit Diophysitism is metaphysically incoherent and their church evolved. It says, what is the division? What is this distinction? In the voice we hear Jesus, and the majesty we see God. What else is there except that we believe that God and Jesus exist in one and the same substance? It says, according to dire Diophysitism is impossible. If there is a single substance of Christ according to Aristotelian substance accident model, this is the second premise, is hypostasis means substance as conceded by Erhan. Third premise is, according to Eastern Orthodox, Constantinople too ecclesiastically defines hypostasis Christologically, and the definition of hypostasis is transformed from Aristotelian substance to, quote, subject, person, end quote, according to Erhan, 6th century. Premise 4, the consensus of the fathers of the first 5 centuries is Christ is a singular Aristotelian hypostasis substance. And then conclusion, right? Its conclusion is for the first 5 centuries, the consensus of the fathers is Christ is a singular Aristotelian hypostasis substance, making Diophysitism impossible for the first 5 centuries. Conjunction, first and 4 premises. Premise 5 is the Oriental and the Eastern Orthodox schism is at the 5th century prior to any language censorship at 6th century. And to determine the right party, you must measure each to the patristic consensus. In premise 6, Diophysitism is impossible for the first 5 centuries in the consensus of the Fathers. This is from the first conclusion. And the second conclusion says Chalcedon erred in 451 and for canonizing something logically, historically, and metaphysically contradictory to the Fathers. This is MP premise 5 plus premise 6. The Eastern Orthodox admit Diophysitism is metaphysically incoherent and their church evolved. There is a more fundamental epistemological error being done by the Chalcedonians, as mentioned before. Here on the previous stream, you cannot measure Eastern Orthodox as the rightful Orthodox and Orientals as a schismatic. Using a council which is after the council which is called in question to determine the rightful schismatic. Oriental Orthodoxy is true if Chalcedon erred, making Eastern Orthodox schismatics. And Oriental Orthodoxy is false if Chalcedon is infallible, making Oriental Orthodox schismatics in this case. You cannot defend Chalcedonians' infallibility by employing Constantinople II because Constantinople II's infallibility is contingent on Chalcedon's infallibility first, making it a circular epistemology. Constantinople II, 553, is after Chalcedon and has no epistemological grounding, authority, supposed infallibility, or supposed ecclesiastical authority in defining theology and dogma until you first justify Chalcedon, 451. There is much easier way to use other councils to judge Chalcedon rather than using later epistemologically unjustified Christological councils. You can use earlier Christological councils. We live in a world where we have a justified independent ecumenical council which took place 20 years before Chalcedon, which is also convened solely to solve Christological disputes. The Council of Ephesus 451. You judge Chalcedon according to an independent, justified past, which is in the case is the Council of Ephesus. Is the Council of Ephesus and is accepted by both Oriental and Eastern Orthodox. You cannot judge Chalcedon according to a later unjustified future council contingent on Chalcedon. It is also worth mentioning that the 431 through 451 period is 2 decades apart, which means that the language and key figures will be the same, and determining who is right and who is wrong will be super easy. And this goes on top, but on top of this, we have spent plenty of time refuting the theology of both Chalcedon and Constantinople too. I only highlight this because it shows you that the problems are a lot deeper. It's not just about like dogmas, people agreeing with the same dogmas. And that's how you're articulating the words, right? And then you want church order to be the way it was back then, right? Which is obviously like it's not going to be. It's like I don't know how to say it, because there's a reason why you have like a history of violence, right, in this religion. So I don't see how this is and I see as a basis for Christian unity, which it isn't. And then I was watching the debate between Avery, God Logic, and I forgot his name, but he goes by the Orthodox Muslim. I mean, in this debate, I think like the Muslim basically just dismantled your imperial faith, right? Nicene Orthodoxy, the thing that you think is this unifying thing when it's not. And yeah, it's based on because the fact that it's not really this faithful continuity that you keep saying. Pre-Nicene Christians did not agree on the words like substance or ousia, right? As I just showed you, even in the time of Chalcedon, it slowly progressed away from even what the Nicene Creed, right, said. But that's what I'm saying is like, even though like I don't agree with the Coptics, right? I'm just saying like they have a good basis for why they say the things they say against Chalcedon and stuff. But for me, like the Nicene Creed, it like represents like a monophysite Jesus, because how Athanasius defines him, like says that he's one thing, right? He's God, in the same sense that the Father is God. So it's not that he's just God and Yahweh, right? But he distinguishes himself from an Arian, and so he basically is making the Son equivalent to the Father in every sense of the word, right? And then it kind of reminds me of like this book I bought recently, right? I took it back because I ordered it on accident, and it was also expensive, right? But it was called, what's it called? Yeah, it was called Christ as Mediator, and had 3 people that it was going over. It was going over their thought on Christ as Mediator. It was who was it? It was Eusebius Caesarea, Macarius of Ankara, I think it was, and then the other one was Athanasius of Alexandria. Yeah, I went straight to Athanasius' part, and yeah, just see what he would say. And he thinks that, I mean, if I read it correctly, he believes that to be the image of God, you have to be God in every sense of the word. And so that's where I think he gets like the idea of that, what he says about like Jesus being homoousios, right? In the scripture, he's not like Adam is made in the image of God, therefore he's not even the same being as God, right? So that's what I mean. It's like the Bible goes against what he's saying, that the man is made in the image of God. Man is a created substance, right, or created being, and yet is the image of God. So he doesn't have to be God in every sense of the word, right? Because man is a different nature. Like God is uncreated, right? God is uncreated, and the man is created, right? And so that's why I said that it's kind of like that he basically, I guess he erred on that part. But again, this is the same saint that dictates the theology of Nicaea, as well as Constantine, right? Who to me represents imperial faith, you know, the pagan Platonism that he came from. So that is how you see the scriptures, right, through these understanding. The God logic had his post debate thing, right? Just, I guess, talking about the debate with his friends. He kept on bringing up the parts because the Muslims said that Jesus is Yahweh in some sense, right? And he didn't understand, like, it doesn't presuppose in a Trinitarian sense. It like everyone can have a view of how Jesus is the Most High God, right? Like even a modalist could say that Jesus is the Most High God because he thinks that the Father is just being all 3 of them, right? All 3 persons. The Father's the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? And so the Son and Spirit are just like a mode that the Father puts on. So it's like the Father as the Son, the Father as the Spirit. And so you'd have to make a distinction, right, with like how is Jesus Yahweh without being a modalist. And then Arians also, you know, I think that's what, like, I think the Muslim wasn't even defending a Muslim position. He was just defending, like, what he thinks the scriptures testify of, right? How Jesus is Yahweh. And Jesus being Yahweh, like, I don't know, it's like a semi-Arian position or something, where he's like a lesser God or something. So even having the same substance, right? He's given like a proportion or so. But he would still be a lesser being, so to say, but not equal in every sense to the Father. Or like a Unitarian, right, could say, like, because you could say, Unitarian could say something like, I think could account for it, right? How a man is Yahweh, the same way how a man is God. Like, it just depends on how you count him as God. Like, it depends on the man's union with God. Like, Jesus has a very unique union with God. He has the Spirit without measure. The fullness of God dwells bodily, right? Now God and man are two distinct beings. And all this can be done through the Spirit. Now a man is like God in the flesh, right? A man being Yahweh could be dependent upon his union with God. That's how you would count a man as, Yahweh or God, right? And man's already the image bearer of God, right? So yeah, he would be like a mirror image of God based on his union with God through the Spirit. And so that's why when the Muslim says like that he's Yahweh in a sense, right, that it presupposes that, like the Unitarian, right, that Jesus isn't Yahweh in the same exact sense as the Father is Yahweh because, Jesus is a man and he has the Spirit of Yahweh upon him or something. And so he can count to us as Yahweh, even the fullness of Yahweh in the flesh, right? Which doesn't at all presuppose a Trinity. And so in that sense, it still presupposes that he's not Yahweh and the way that the Father is Yahweh, because Jesus is a man who is the image bearer of Yahweh, basically. And this is why I say that doesn't make any sense to God Logic and his friends and Trinitarians, right? They said that he didn't give you the debate. He took from you the position of Jesus being Yahweh. Basically how it can only be, like, the way that Trinitarians mean, that it means in the same sense as the Father is Yahweh, equal in every sense, right? It says that I told him that you have to distinguish from a modalist because, he too can, in a different sense, believes that Jesus is that the Son is Yahweh. But it's like not the same thing as a Trinitarian, where a position like that the Muslim was arguing for is a different position entirely, right? So it doesn't concede anything to God logic. Like here someone was saying like, it says, so God logic makes his opponent submit to the topic debate, which is Jesus is the Most High, is getting cooked, and he thinks it's like Muslim logic. But it's like, I told them that, but Avery didn't prove, according to the New Testament, how Jesus is Yahweh, according to like Trinitarianism, right? As defined by the Creed. He said the Muslim proved his position by understanding a man can be counted as Yahweh based upon his union with Yahweh rather than what God logic believes, right? Which is the divine person is the Son, and that person being God in unison with his human nature. Because they believe that God the Son came down from heaven, right? A pre-existing God Son, who is in the same sense God like the Father is God. That they would have put on human nature, right? Is able to put it on and then also remain God at the same time in the same sense that the Father is God and be consubstantial with us, right? As we are men. Men who depend on God, who have faith in God, right? That the righteous shall live by faith. Jesus, we are justified by the righteousness of Jesus, which does presuppose the faith of Jesus. This is why he must be a man. Even if he's a unique begotten man or a new Adam, right? Man is just one nature. Man is one thing, right? And so like a cup that bears water, you pour water into a cup, you keep pouring it in proportions, right? Of the substance of water into a cup. The cup is a water bearer, right? It's almost equivalent to, or analogous to, how in the Bible describes how the Spirit, right? Spirit of God pours out his Spirit onto all flesh, right? Sometimes he gives some proportion to some, he gives the most to Jesus, or without measure, right? So Jesus would be like a God bearer, because he bears the substance of God in him, right? Or the nature, this Spirit, right? Which are the principles and characters of the deity, even manifesting the powers and the gifts, the divine gifts, right? The divine powers and stuff. And so a man can do that if he has faith in God, right? God enables a man to do that. So in that sense, he's a God bearer. That doesn't mean he's a God's son, right? He's still a man. He doesn't cease to be a man. Just like God doesn't cease to be God, right? But their idea is that the divine person comes down from heaven, assumes human nature. And because he has a universal human nature, they count this deity as a man, based on his union with human nature without being a human person, which is basically operating the mode of a man without being a man, basically. And so that's not really a man, but it's still God. That's why I say you don't have a true man there. Remember, the Son has to taste death, has to have faith in God, and so without doing that, cannot save you. Can they prove that God can die in his flesh? No, they cannot. In fact, this all goes back to, like I said, Constantine, Athanasius, and I think Paul in the Bible refutes this, right, in the book of Acts or so, where they were doing miracles, and these unbelievers, right, saw them doing miracles, and they said, "Oh, look, these are." They said, "These are the gods that come down from heaven in the likeness of men." Right? That these are gods, but they look like men, right? And Paul refutes that and just says, like, why you say we are gods? We are men, right? And so I know, like some of their saints believe, like the Athanasius, right? I think Cyril of Alexandria, right? He thinks that Jesus is God. I think Saint Cyril of Alexandria said this as well, right? That they think that Jesus is God, and that he's just as much as much as God as the Father is God, right? And then they go to the miracles as proof of his deity. And I'm like, that's equivalent to what this unbeliever thought that he was seeing, right? Gods in the likeness of man, not really men but gods, but you try to get around that by saying his human nature is real or he's fully man, right? Which is where you get your Nestorianism from. Because now you take God and you split him into two different things. So you try to say he remains whole, and so he's just operating in the mode of a man, right? Because that's how you count him as a man. Just because he possesses a universal human nature. And I'm just saying, like, well, if a man possessed the divine nature, right, the Spirit of God, then he is counted as God in some sense. Even a son of God. Even Elohim, right? So that's what I'm saying. Like, yeah, that's why to me in that debate, he kind of refuted the whole, like, Nicene Orthodoxy, Magisterium, because the theology of the councils, right? The theology of the councils is based on the false presupposition about how Jesus is God, you see. And so that's what I'm saying. It's like, once you understand that their imperial religion of the Christian faith, which was not established by the apostles or Jesus, because it says give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and what is God's is God's. And obviously I would put the imperial faith as something that is from Caesar, not God, right? Not Jesus. And he did not come to start a new religion, remember? And all this faith of the imperium, theology of the councils, seeking approval of the empire, seeking approval of the empire, all that to me represents a new religion. It's an imperial Christianity in its imperial form, so to say, which is why I don't believe in it. And this other person, I think, agrees with me, right? Like I said, God logic never expected Orthodox Muslim will come in and with Christian arguments to prove his points. And that is exactly what Orthodox Muslim did. That is where God logic was taken off balance. Orthodox Muslim is actually intelligent. Yeah, I would agree. Like, he did a great job. I think it's like him and Jake the Muslim metaphysician and Dean Responds, right? I like listening to them. I think they're very knowledgeable, very smart people, Muslims, right? So I like to listen to everyone, not just one group, right? And I responded with, I said, yes, I like the way he argued. Once you accept that Jesus is Yahweh, and in a way that doesn't agree with Trinitarians, it forces them, Trinitarians, to make even more distinctions, and that you'd have to deal with other interpretation of how he's Yahweh, whereas others like modalists, Arians, and Unitarian, right? Like those who agree that he's Yahweh, like I know some like believe he's not Yahweh at all, right? But the position can still presuppose that if you can account for it without the Trinitarianism, and that's the way I like to argue, right? That you say certain statements, and it's like, can I take that from you and fit it into my paradigm, where I'd have to force you to argue to make even more distinctions. And when you do that, you fall into like other heresies, right? Like when you try to get around Nestorianism, like how I frame certain things, right? They force you to admit that, yeah, you believe in two sons, and you try to get around it. Because I know you believe that Jesus is God, right? In the same sense that the Father is God. And that to me is like Okay, then that reduces you to just monophysitism, despite how you will say that you believe in this human nature, right? Human nature is real or something. But it's just going to reduce it to not being logically provable, because God cannot die according to the flesh. Right? So you'd have to be like a modalist or something, or a Nestorian, or you try to get around them. You fall into some other heresy or something, like Arianism, or no, maybe Arianism. Okay, you start describing him in a different sense, and maybe he's not in the same sense of the Father as God, right? Like having the same substance doesn't mean you're still like equal in all sense, right, to the Father. You can still be a lesser God, but you have the same substance. I think the Muslim touched up on this, right, when it came to Adam and Eve, right? Yeah, when something, I think, if I remember correctly, like Adam and Eve are the same substance of man, but one is put above the other, which shows that they don't have equality in all sense of the word, right? But they are equal in like his image and being of, in humanity. But there's like a hierarchy, though, right? God puts man above woman, and God is above man, right? But God is above all. So the only way that the Son is above all is like the way Adam was above creation or other created things, right? The federal head of all men, all people, and God is above that, right? And so just having the same substance does not entail that you have. I guess it doesn't entail that you're equal in every sense. And so that's why when he doesn't know the hour, right, it's better to understand that it's still like a man who doesn't know it, rather than saying he's God and doesn't know it, because then you create like a lesser God by doing that. So that's why I say the Bible speaks of him being a new man. But anyway, and I just told him that that God logic didn't prove his understanding, and was best one. He didn't prove his understanding was the best, right? Like the best explanation for all the data. I think that was a point that the Muslim Orthodox was saying in this beginning, right? That what a best accounts for all the data that you see in the scriptures, right? So God logic did not prove that his understanding best explained all of the verses, right? And then, it was not the best possible explanation. This is sort of like something I wanted to touch up on, like what I was saying, how like Nicaea is not a unifying idea or a basis for unity. It was like written from Doctrine and Power by Carlos R. Galveo Sabrillo. This is about theological controversy and Christian leadership in the later Roman Empire. I read from it before, like on the part where like even after the Nicene Creed, still had people disputing, the language and ideas of the creed. They wanted to like reform it, right? Because they didn't think it was scriptural, didn't sound scriptural, right? It just shows that you're not really filled with this universal Catholic spirit, so to say. You used to have plenty of like Protestantism in you, or schismatic or violent schisms, right? Like just right here is just a small proportion. Like just the stuff that Constantine had to deal with when it came to Christians, like within their own respective traditions, right? Even like this one was within the same tradition. But that's what I'm saying, like traditional values are good, but traditionalism is like if each Christian holds to their order is tied to their traditionalism, which is the problem for those who believe like in established churches or something. So you're not going to have much unity. You're not going to have much unity, right? Probably end up with violent schismatics or so. Because people just sometimes won't agree. Because I know like some Christian nationalists like want to encourage like people to go to church, right? But I don't remember which Bible society it was. I think at one point like people were like fined for not going to church. And so it's like, I don't know, what if like somebody doesn't want to go to church? Is that a problem for you, right? You know, it just depends on how you view church-state order. Because that's the only thing I'm concerned about. Is church-state order. Like, I don't care about your dogma, what you claim is true. As long as there's freedom to dispute it, like, I don't have to accept it, and that's fine, I guess. I just agree that the American order ought to have a God, that it ought not be based on neutrality, right? Like here, Constantine is just writing to Alexander and Arius. There's a letter addressed to them. It says, quote, "Has arisen among you, you who have but one and the same reasoning, so that it is possible for you to come together in communion," end quote. Christian quarrels hampered Constantine's plans to build a glorious future for a new united empire after his conquest of the East. The emperor hoped to create a new commonwealth in which all his subjects would live in peace and harmony, including pagans who would surely give up their error and voluntarily come over to the truth. Constantine expected church leaders to work closely with him to realize his vision, but their squabbles threatened to ruin his project. It also reminds me of because I know the Eastern Orthodox, some of them, not all of them, like monarchy and all that stuff. I think sometimes they just, what they really want is like absolute monarchy or something. Okay, but Byzantine emperors and the Coptic Christians, right, they don't have a good history. Because like how some of these like Byzantine emperors genocided some of these, Orthodox Christians, or the Coptic ones, the Orientals. So that's what I'm saying, if you keep thinking the same way, because that's how the traditionalism, right? They think the same way. They don't change anything really. And so the same outcome, I would say, would obviously be logical. Repeating the same mistake, basically, because you think the same exact way, and sort of ties into the Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian dispute, right? Diophysite and Monophysite Christians. They go in circles. I don't agree with either one of them. Because like I told you, they're both Nicene. They believe in how Jesus is God, according to that creed. According to Athanasius, or like the Alexandrian tradition and Constantine's idea. But they go in circles because they don't really question the idea of how he's God. But they accept the way the creed has defined it, right? And so, I understand why a Chalcedonian would create that separation between his human nature and the divine person, because that is logical. In reality, God and man are two different subjects. They're not one and the same thing. And so, yeah, you would actually end up back in Chalcedonianism, doing that, saying that kind of language, which the Coptics can never agree with because they know that's heretical. But not understanding how he's God leads to this kind of heresy. That's what I'm saying. It leads to this kind of heresies, getting him wrong, misinterpreting it, right? And your whole tradition is just based on this false opinion. And then, as I said, they don't exactly get out of the error because they continue in the same way of thinking of being faithful to Nicaea, right? And I said, no, it's necessary to come out of that. Yeah, it says that Constantine expected church leaders to work closely with him to realize his vision, but their squabbles threatened to ruin his project. Indeed, how could the bishops lead God's people, the, quote, just ones, end quote, when they were so badly divided among themselves? How could pagans find, quote, tranquility and peace, end quote, in a church plagued by strife? Disheartened by the news he received from various churches, Constantine determined to put an immediate end to the division the controversy had caused. His intervention, as we shall see, politicized theology and transformed theological disputes, indeed theological speculation in general, into highly charged affairs full of intrigue and danger for dissenting churchmen. Constantine's demand for church unity led bishops to formulate an, quote, official, end quote, definition of God, of the Creed of Nicaea, which the emperor received as a, quote, gift from God, end quote, and to which he accorded a quasi-legal status. But a consequence of making belief, quote, official, end quote, was that churchmen could subsequently achieve positions of leadership in the church only if they accepted that creed as the standard of orthodoxy. Prelates who rejected or dissented from the Nicene Creed risked being challenged by Christians who had supported it, and being punished by an emperor who saw himself acting as God's agent on earth. These developments made doctrinal disputes treacherous affairs because, despite Constantine, doubts remained about the orthodoxy of the formula ratified at Nicaea, and the Nicene Creed sought to accomplish the impossible: reconcile notions of the Son of God that could be reconciled. That's basically what I wanted to touch upon. This unity, right? It's like, you blame a lot of this stuff on Protestantism, but a lot of the problems stem from you to begin with. Remember? This one is like, I don't know, I guess this has to do with Russian Orthodox Messianism or something. Because I know some of these people from Rokor, because I wonder why, like, you promote the idea of, like, the emperor and all this other stuff, right? And I understand it's because of your church order and it's your religion. But no, I don't believe it's about biblical monarchy. I think it's about something else, right? And so that's why, like, I find these things, like, this one guy was just responding to Jay Dyer, right? I forgot his name, but he was talking about the defenders of orthodoxy. He had a source. I think this one was one of them. Religious origin and political extension of the idea of Moscow, the Third Rome. Abstract says, the idea of, quote, Moscow, the Third Rome, end quote, is a unique phenomenon in Russian religious culture. It is the idea that the Russian state, represented by Moscow, is the, quote, Third Rome, end quote, that succeeded Rome and Constantinople and has a mission to save the world. Although this idea was initially a religious doctrine, the consciousness of Russian nationalism and the universalist mission of salvation extended from this idea have been deeply embedded in the Russian national character and way of thinking through the efforts of Russian intellectuals since the 21st century. The thought of, quote, Moscow, Third Rome, end quote, has been closely integrated with politics and gradually became one of the primary ideological sources of contemporary Russian geopolitical theory. The purpose of the study is to investigate the concept of Moscow, Third Rome, in relation to the genesis of Russian civilization. Goes on to talk about something else, but that's all that I got from that, because it's a long document. Yeah, I think this is the same thing, right? It says source of Russian geopolitical thought. There's a combination of religious and political elements. The idea of Moscow, Third Rome, provided the ideological basis for the tendency for the expansion of geopolitical thinking in modern Russia. The idea underpinned by the uniqueness of Russian civilization and the Russian idea of a universalist messianism also became a determining factor in the anti-Western Russian geopolitical line and formed the basis for the defense of Russia's assertive foreign policy, anti-Western, because I know a lot of you talk about, like, you're always talking about the death of Western civilization and all this other stuff. Yeah, but a lot of it sounds like propaganda, to be honest. Just like the promoting of orthodoxy online just doesn't make any sense. It's also, like, one of the reasons why, like, I'm still not Orthodox. I just don't think it's very, like, I just don't see it as honest, basically. This idea rooted in Russian historical tradition has become an indispensable source of thought for the Russian public and elite. As evidenced by the different periods of Russia's existence, however, it should be noted that the concept of Moscow, the Third Rome, is essentially a religious, spiritual doctrine, and neither this concept nor the universal and messianic ideas derived from it can justify or legitimate Russia's intervention in other countries. Okay. I mean, that's fine if you want to have some ideology for your country. So I sort of do the same thing with America, right? What I believe the Lord has revealed to me. On the same subject, I found this book, The Liturgical Past in Byzantium and Early Rus by Sean Griffin. I was reading the review and it seems like it touches up on this idea. what you believe about, like, this mythology of the Third Rome, right? It's not just Russia, as some of these Orthodox nations or so, right? And the review is saying how that a lot of it is not rooted in history. It's rooted in liturgical storytelling. But you already know my views on Nicene Orthodoxy. Even though I like Orthodoxy, I like the Orthodox Church. I just don't agree with you on your idea of church order. No, I think Locke is Christian, and Locke determines with the founders, right, and dissenting Christians how America is Christian. So, I don't know, I think I fight the more important battle of interpreting Locke as a Christian. I think that is more important to how America is Christian than Christian traditionalism that's full of lies and distortions and mythology. It's just, to us, God is real. Natural rights are real. They are a gift of God, right? There are things that are said in the Declaration and the Constitution that are foundational to us as we interpret America as a Christian nation in light of Locke's understanding. I think that is what God has established. Did not establish monarchy in this country. So that's why it's like the idea of monarchy in my country that weighs on me. Just like the idea of the hypostatic union, right? I first started questioning that teaching. It's like, yeah, God weighed on me not to be accepting that. That I ought not accept that. But anyway, like in this chapter, same book, it says, I forgot what chapter it was, but there's one section that says, "The fire that burns the unworthy." It talks about what, like, liturgical worship being a technology or something. Very interesting. It says that the Byzantines had for centuries possessed a technology of immense political value. It offered protection from invasion and inspired wonder and admiration among foreigners. Highly trained specialists sequestered in secluded compounds oversaw its execution and made vows never to speak of its secrets to the enemy. The technology was widely believed to be an invincible weapon, and the Romans often turned to it in times of war. Those who beheld it in action marveled at the beauty, but feared they might be consumed like wax or grass. Contemporaries were in all of this fire that burned the unworthy, but it was not the famous Greek fire, nor were the specialists who guarded its soldiers. The experts were priests and monks, and the political technology they safeguarded was the divine liturgy of the Byzantine Church, right? Consider once more the list of items important to us around the turn of the millennium. Churches, monasteries, a professional clergy, church books, icons, relics, precisely the things required for performing the liturgy. The princes in Kiev spent vast sums to install a very material imperial Roman technology throughout their realm. But what exactly was the purpose of this technology? What did the rites actually do that made the Khagans willing to invest and keep investing in them? Were they strictly a means of communicating with God and the saints via the intercession of the clergy? Or was something else far mundane and subversive also taking place when early medieval men and women attended the divine services? Over the course of this book, I will attempt to show that the rites of the Church were in fact powerful ideological tools, a form of mass propaganda, which gave rulers control over their subjects by giving them control over the sacred past. Early medievalists are by now aware that the past and narrative history of any sort is a construction. They are perhaps less aware that in early Rus it was the liturgy largely doing the constructing. Indeed, I am persuaded that it was liturgy more than any other medium which created a perception of the sacred past and which instilled that perception in the minds of the people. Standing at worship, the Rus learned of the fall and the Exodus, the Incarnation and the cross, the witness of the martyrs, and the conversion of kings, the universal history of the world from Adam to Christ, from Adam and Christ to Constantine the Great, was transmitted across Rus on the notes of liturgical song, as the clergy sang and prayed these songs day after day. The imported past slowly became a narrative past. The sacred history of the Christian Roman Empire gradually became the sacred history of the Rus. We are therefore justified in viewing the liturgy as something more than the private internal prayer of priests and monks. I should like to suggest that the liturgical rites can also be interpreted as a public technology for creating and controlling cultural memory. Services were undoubtedly a form of religious devotion, of personal piety, and public prayer, but they also served another more worldly function. Every day of every year, for centuries without ceasing, the church rites broadcast an imaginary Christian path throughout the land of Rus. We can be quite certain that the broadcast was certainly with more than the salvation of souls. It was concerned with more than the salvation of souls. Right, your political theology, I guess. I mean, so it's a very interesting book. Haven't finished it yet, though. But yeah, that's one of the books I found on the subject. So far, I read a couple of books on Locke. I like his understanding, as far as I'm concerned. I see it as a form of contributing to Christian order, and like I read Property and the Pursuit of Happiness by Edward J. Erler. This is about Locke, the Declaration of Independence, Madison, and the Challenge of the Administrative State. I also finished Binding Locke's God by Nathan Guy. Both do a good job understanding him as a Christian, that there's only one God to his liberalism, right? Otherwise, it's like adultery. You shall have no other gods besides me. So Locke cannot be creating a God of liberalism that is a separate God from his religious views, right? I'm currently reading John Locke's Political Philosophy and the Hebrew Bible, Aichiel Leiter, if I said that correctly. It's pretty good, and I got this part from it. It says, on the other side of the theoretical spectrum, John Donne understands Locke's equality as quote, a Christian egalitarianism, end quote, in the context of the Protestant doctrine of the calling. And according to this doctrine, individuals are, quote, put into this world in particular social situations, end quote, and, quote, they are called by God to fill a particular role, end quote. It is their Christianity that makes them equal. Jimmy Waldron seems to have been caught for some time between these two extremely divergent positions. He admits to having been initially troubled by an assertion made by Alistair MacIntyre to the effect that, quote, the arguments of John Locke concerning basic equality and individual rights were so imbued with religious content that they were not fit constitutionally to be taught in the public schools of the United States of America, end quote. Waldron testifies that he was of the opinion that MacIntyre was mistaken when he heard him make this claim, thinking, quote, that the theory and that if it was a defensible secular conception of equality would remain. This is in quote. 17 years after hearing MacIntyre's remarks, he, quote, had second thoughts about the bracketing possibility, end quote. Concluded that MacIntyre was right, saying that Locke's equality claims are not separable from the theological content that shapes and organizes them. The theological content cannot simply be bracketed off as a curiosity. It shapes and informs the account through and through. The range, property on which Locke relies is simply unintelligible apart from those religious concerns, and so there is no way around it. Lockean equality is not fit to be taught as a secular doctrine. It is a conception of equality that makes no sense, except in the light of a particular account of the relation between man and God. That like the way it frames that as not being able to separate his liberal values from his religious values, right? Which is good because you ought to build on an actual God, and neutrality is not a God at all. Like neutrality doesn't say anything. Like if it were a God, how would that work? Could it tell you anything or expand on human dignity and stuff? Or are these just things like religion that you just come up with, right? Everyone makes religion what they make of it, right? Or something like that. It doesn't make any sense because that would lead to more religious opinion than the eternal divine truths, like according to like nature's God or so. This is from Property and Pursuit of Happiness, where Locke himself professed Christianity. I know some people try to interpret him as like a theist or atheist or anything but Christian, right? Which is more of the secular interpretation, which is a distortion. He said, truly I did not think myself so considerable that the world need be troubled about me, whether I were a follower of Socinius, Arminius, Calvin, or any other leader of a sect amongst Christians. A Christian I am sure I am, because I believe Jesus to be the Messiah, the King and Savior promised and sent by God, and as a subject of his kingdom, I take the rule of my faith and life from the will declared and left upon record in the inspired writings of the apostles and evangelists in the New Testament, which I endeavor to the utmost of my power, as is my duty, to understand in their true sense and meaning, to lead me into their true meaning. I know no infallible guide, but the same Holy Spirit from whom these writings at first came. And the book goes on to say there's no compelling reason. Yeah, there's no compelling reason, I believe, not to accept Locke's profession of faith. It should be already clear, however, that Locke is not an Orthodox Christian. He is a heterodox in many respects, but we are surely not surprised to find heterodoxy among political philosophers. Heterodoxy, however, is not the same as atheism. All philosophers, in one way or another, ask the question, quid sit deus? Non-political philosophers who actively confront the theological political problem will be subject to charges of heterodoxy, if not atheism. There is no doubt that Locke sought major reforms of Christian doctrine that he believed would be politically salutary. Those reforms were aimed most immediately at reducing the course of influence of sectarianism on religious tolerance and on preparing the ground for the establishment of constitutional government. This one, the same source, Property and Pursuit of Happiness. Pursuit of Happiness and the Reasonableness of Christianity. Locke continued and discussed of the pursuit of happiness and the reasonableness of Christianity, published anonymously 6 years after the appearance of an essay concerning human understanding in 1689. The reasonableness of Christianity might be characterized as a kind of, quote, original intent in, quote, theology, an effort to explicate biblical text by teaching, quote, plainly the doctrine of our Savior and his apostles as delivered in the Scriptures, and not as taught by the several sects of Christians, in quote, by advocating a strict reliance on biblical text. Locke endeavored to diminish the influence of sectarianism and its internecine disputes. Victor Nouveau rightly notes that the reasonableness of Christianity, quote, purports to be entirely biblical and exegetical, end quote. And as such, quote, it, quote, is free of a priori constraints of orthodoxy and creedal or confessional standards, end quote. Locke relates that he had seen in his own reading of biblical text, quote, what a plain, simple, reasonable thing Christianity was, suited to all conditions and capacities, end quote. What we seek in Scripture, Locke contends, is not some system of theology or sectarianism, but knowledge of, quote, the will of our Lord, end quote. Where that will, quote, is spoken plainly, we cannot miss it, and it is evident he requires our assent, end quote. Where, however, there is obscurity and ambiguity, as Locke readily admits there frequently is, there must be a fair effort to understand the text. The effort itself secures the faithful, quote, from guilty disobedience to his will, or a sinful error in faith, end quote. however the obscurity or ambiguity is resolved, or whether it is left unresolved. If God had required more, he would have declared his will, quote, as clearly, as uniformly as he did the fundamental article, that we were to believe him to be the Messiah, our King, end quote. Locke was accused of being a Socinian, and by extension an atheist, as well as a deist. The charge of Socinianism cannot be taken seriously because, as John C. Higgins Bedell notes, quote, some polemicists applied the label to anyone who deviated in any way on matters of the Trinity or atonement, or those who advocated religious toleration or the use of reason and light in religion. Locke, of course, denied that he was a Socinian, insists on the importance and the necessity of revelation. His claim that he had not read Rokovian text, however, should be taken with the same degree of skepticism as his statement that he had never read the, quote, justly decried, end quote, works of Hobbes, and goes on to say something else. Yeah, but I just wanted to get that part to understand, like, what he's accused of and how he thought. Here's the same book, the book Property and Pursuit of Happiness, right? Just goes over their, adamant on strictly Republican government, even if it has democratic principles, right? And constitutionalism, its federalism, it is strictly still considered a form of Republican government. And they're basically anti-monarchian and didn't like democracy at all. Like here it says, strictly Republican government and the fundamental principles of the Revolution. Madison's central reason that the proposed Constitution must be, quote, strictly Republican was, we recall, because, strictly Republican, end quote, was, we recall, because it was the only form of government reconcilable with the fundamental principles of the Revolution, end quote. The statement of Madison should settle the question of whether the framers of the Constitution believe they derived any guidance with respect to the form of government required from the principles of the Declaration. Still, one accomplished commentator argues to the contrary. It might, quote, seem that only a Republican form of government is strictly in accordance with the transcendent law of nature and nature's God, but this publicist never says, our commentator avers, quote, he seems much more certain that Republican government is dictated by the genius of the American people and even by the fundamental principles of the Revolution, and that it is dictated by nature or natural law, end quote. But how is it possible not to include that the, quote, fundamental principles of the Revolution, end quote, the Declaration of Independence, are not a dictate of, quote, nature and natural law, end quote? Surely no one would argue that the Declaration, grounded as it is in the, quote, laws of nature and of nature's God, end quote, it is not an expression or, quote, dictate, end quote, of natural law or natural right. Another prominent observer of the founding, Professor Harvey Mansfield, while recognizing that the Declaration was intended to be an expression of natural law, argues, says the Declaration specifies that government derive their just powers by consent, but it does not specify which government to do that best. It does not even rule out any forms of government, though absolute monarchy seems to be rejected by implication. Limited monarchy, however, such as the existing British government, is apparently included among governments that could gain the consent of a people. Otherwise, it would have made no sense to list, quote, a long train of abuses and usurpations, end quote, in the longest part of the Declaration. It would have been enough to say that monarchy is illegitimate in itself. Apparently, all governments must rule by consent, but there is some leeway not only in the details of free government, but even in the character or form of the government as a whole, end quote. The claim here is that limited monarchy might be consistent with the principles of the Declaration if it received the consent of the governed. seems to be wholly at odds with Madison's judgment that the form of government must be, quote, strictly republican, and, quote, would it have sufficed for the Declaration to have issued an ipse dixit that monarchy is inherently illegitimate, and leave it at that? The Declaration was not a logical treatise, but an example of philosophic rhetoric of the highest level. It was meant to convince by argument and to marshal evidence in support of argument. Surely the part of the world still held in the grip of divine right monarchy would be shocked and repelled by the fact that the American colonies proclaimed themselves, quote, absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, end quote. Allegiance was a sacred obligation that could only be dissolved with the permission of the king. As we have seen, under divine right kingship, there are no citizens, only subjects owning perpetual allegiance. It is only on the basis of the arguments of the Declaration that subjects become citizens, and once the natural rights basis for rule is discovered in the consent of the governed, subjects become citizens and thereby not only acquire a right to become active participants in their own governance, but also assume a duty to do so. This is the essence of self-government. Elective monarchy seems excluded almost by definition. The examples of King George's perfidy, the, quote, long train of abuses pursuing invariably the same object, end quote, to reduce, quote, these states, end quote, to, quote, absolute tyranny, end quote, were necessary to complete the rhetorical arguments. They were part of the enthymeme that was meant to persuade a skeptical world that self-government was resting on the sovereignty of the people, not the divine right of kings. Not the divine right of kings was the just and rightful form of government. That's responding to, I think it's Professor West, and John G. West, I think it was. He supports, like, government support of religion, thinks that, because he thinks that the founders supported some form of government support. And the author of the book, Property in Pursuit of Happiness, he believes in, like, strict separation. But even strict separation, like I've shown, right, can be considered still a Christian principle, right? So here Professor West cites two passages from Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia that he contends proves that Jefferson's confusion on the issue of government and religion is irredeemable. In the first, Jefferson famously remarked, quote, it does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God, and neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg, end quote. Even though to me that only makes, like, sense on a personal level, it doesn't make sense as far as, like, on the level of, like, government, like the God of the Declaration, right? Like the God of the American order. It wouldn't work on that level because it would, like, cause fracturing, because you'd have them all agreeing and having control over the foundation of, like, the foundation of your, liberal values or whatever you believe in, right? The American values. Because it ties into the God that is bound to. And so the second statement for Professor West argues is a stark contradiction of the first. Quote, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure, end quote. Jefferson wrote, quote, when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God, end quote. West believes the two passages show hopeless confusion on Jefferson's part. The presence of the atheist is a matter of indifference, but liberties are secure only with the conviction that they are the gift of God. How did Jefferson miss the obvious confusion in passages separated only by a few paragraphs? We remember the argument from Locke's A Letter Concerning Toleration, that government can deal with issues of civil goods, but not with matters of the soul or opinions with respect to religion. Locke, however, argues that atheists do not have to be tolerated because their presence will tend to undermine the morality that is derived from observance of religion. Jefferson, however, argues here that the atheist and the polytheist are to be tolerated, even though both adhere to views that are not only false but also harmful to Republican government. From the point of view of the theology of the Declaration, atheism and polytheism are irrational. Atheism would ultimately mean that all law is positive, having no transcendent source or ground in God's eternal law. The Declaration clearly relies on a creator, quote, all men are created equal, end quote, and a creation that is intelligible, of which human beings form part of an ordeal whole. And as every reader of Plato's Euthyphro knows, polytheism leads to the untenable conclusion that the world is made up of only fighting gods, much like Oliver Wendell Holmes' quote, fighting faiths, end quote, or in contemporary parlance, quote, competing value systems, end quote. Rational monotheism and revealed monotheism in the Declaration are in complete agreement in rejecting both atheism and polytheism. Yet Jefferson's hatred of sectarian tyranny was so thoroughgoing that he thought it better to tolerate those few who adhered to such beliefs, rather than to allow government to engage in coercion by disabling such persons with civil or criminal penalties. Private instruction from fellow citizens and the gentle persuasion of community opinion would be a more effective way of bringing to quote true religion, end quote, those who could not be authentic Republican citizens because they believed in polytheism or did not believe their, quote, rights come from the hand of God, end quote. Same book. This one, Property and Pursuit of Happiness. Jefferson and Madison correctly argued, as did the New Hampshire Constitution, that a mixture of church and state was harmful to both. Politics are corrupt by spiritual power, and religion is corrupted by the admixture of political authority. There's no biblical support for religious establishment. In fact, all evidence points to the opposite direction. Harry Jaffa rightly notes, quote, America was founded upon the wise conviction that to make a state officially Christian would defeat the ends of Christianity. This conviction was forfeited by the devastation wrought upon Christian civilization by the internecine wars and persecutions of Christian states in the centuries preceding the American founding or American Revolution. These wars and persecutions, waged in the name of Christian truth, were in their own way every bit as cruel as those waged in the name of atheistic ideologies in the 20th century. The memory of the wars of religion was still fresh in the minds of both Madison and Jefferson, who led the movement supported by George Washington for this establishment in Virginia. It goes on to talk about, says, how did the Christianity that presided over the wars of religion become the Christianity that supported the separation of church and state of the American founding? Now, we saw in chapter 2 that the Protestant theologians of the founding era accepted the idea that reason and revelation were the twin pillars of Christian doctrine, and that religious liberty and political liberty depended upon the separation of church and state. This was in large part a legacy of Locke, whom the Protestant ministers have studied and frequently referred to in their sermons. Locke's Reasonableness of Christianity presented a reading of the New Testament that was non-sectarian within Protestantism. When Jefferson referred in his first inaugural to an America, quote, enlightened by a benign religion, end quote, he meant primarily the religion that had been taught to American theologians by Locke's Reasonableness of Christianity and a letter concerning toleration. They supported religious freedom and the rights of conscience, considered them natural rights, and supported the separation of church and state and as a political doctrine required by both reason and revelation. This was the accommodation between theology and politics that allowed the American experiment in Republican government to proceed unencumbered by theological political disputes. Jefferson and Madison worked diligently to prevent the revival of those disputes that would have made the American founding less successful, if not altogether impossible. This last part I want to mention. Let me see. It's from the same book in the appendix. Property and pursuit of happiness. Let me see. So, how the revolution was intended to promote change, right, in both opinion and practice, and not to ratify circumstances as they existed at the time of the revolution. It just goes on to talk about the states, right, like how they, even after they had a constitution or so, they still had religious persecution or so, or states not following the constitution. I don't know, I guess because of like their traditionalism, again, having more importance than the Constitution and Declaration or so. At least that's the impression that I got, like, when I was reading this part. Because to me, it's like if they don't see it as Christian, then they won't defend it or so. That's why the secularist is like dangerous, like, yeah, the anti-Christian liberal. I mean, he convinces all these Christians that America's not Christian, and why would Christians fight for it, right? Why would they obey it? Like, why would they obey it, you know? I mean, the only reason we defend is because we believe it's Christian. The only reason I defend Locke is because I believe it's Christian. It has nothing to do with the liberalism of non-Christian liberals, right? The states were not the standard bearers for Republican government during the founding era. We have only to recall Madison's statement in Federalist 10, quote, "Our governments are too unstable that the public good is disregarded, and the conflict of the rival parties, and that the measures are too often decided, not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority," end quote. This was majority faction, and it was this disregard of the public good and private rights in the states that led to the Constitutional Convention. The states could hardly be said to represent the standard for religious freedom, as it were understood by the founders. The strongest statement of separation, quoted from the New Hampshire Constitution, represented widespread sentiment on the subject of religious liberty, but as the New Hampshire Supreme Court decision illustrated, states were too often willing to violate their own constitutions, frequently sacrificing the rights of minorities to majority factions. The majority of state constitutions, for example, had provisions calling for separation of powers, but in almost all the states, these provisions were routinely violated, leading to legislative dominance that worked the will of majority factions, and the states were hardly a model of stable Republican government, and the Constitutional Convention was a revolutionary appeal to the people to find a stable basis for justice and the common good, most particularly protections for the free exercise of religion and the rights of conscience. And or I can see briefly, it says Jefferson and Madison correctly argued as to the New Hampshire Constitution that a mixture of church and state was harmful to both. Politics are corrupted by spiritual power, and religion is corrupted by the admixture of political authority. And there's no biblical support for the religious establishment. And it goes on to give that. It goes on to quote Harry Jaffa. I think I've read that quote already in the page, what it was about. So anyway, so that's why I believe that America, I see it as a Christian order and a superior one, a better one. It just needs to understand itself as a Christian nation in light of Locke's understanding and dissenting Christians, which I believe those two things contribute to how the Americans see it as Christian and liberal, and how they see American order, which is constantly distorted by, I would agree, both like anti-liberal Christians and anti-Christian liberals, which are both a type of fundamentalism of some kind. But they have one thing in agreement: they don't want Locke defining it. They don't want Locke's Christianity defining the American order, right? The foundation of so. They would rather interpret him as a theist, or allow him to be interpreted as a theist, or something other than a Christian, right? I don't know. I don't see very many Christians like arguing for him being a Christian. I just see them conceding that, even though I think like Locke builds on a tradition that is that has like as his ideas are not his own, right? Like toleration, like you have Erasmus, right? Reformers, yeah, reformers And going back to Erasmus's time, the Roman Catholic, right? And so Locke certainly builds on a tradition. And it still, I guess, has a Christian take on those ideas, right? A Christian basis for those ideas. I think it's really that tradition that's more superior than, creedal dogmas, Nicene Orthodoxy, the stuff that, like, Andrew Wilson and some of these Orthodox online, they feel that their order was a better order, which I've demonstrated that no, it was not. And to this day, it's like, and that's why I bring up the debate with the Muslim and God logic, right? Basically, that whole magisterial Nicene tradition basically failed him, right? And dismantled very easily by simple natural reason. It was just basically what the Muslim was just, utilizing, right? And so that's what I mean. Like, force was the only thing that was unifying you, but force does not give you the truth of Scripture, the truth of God, which in and of itself has the more, as just actual power in the idea or so. If that makes sense. Like, but imperial force doesn't give you the truth of God and the unity that you seek, right? As a church order or something. So now I think what the founders established with God, of course, and Locke and dissenting Christians, a better order. It's just missing the true God of Locke, right? That's what I think is the heart of the problem, the heart of illiberalism. Like, if Locke is the father of liberalism, right? But he's a Protestant, he's not a theist. And you shouldn't separate his liberalism from his God, right? That's how you create a distortion, right? Which is probably the basis of illiberalism. I mean, it's just my thoughts. You don't have to agree with everything. But anyway, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you and God bless.